Upon returning from a trip, a millionaire finds a 7-year-old little beggar crying while cleaning the floor of his mansion. What he decides to do next will move you. The imposing iron gates of the Richardson estate creaked open as Thomas Richardson's black Mercedes pulled into the long, winding driveway. The autumn leaves scattered across the path, dancing in the wake of his car as it made its way toward the mansion that had stood empty for the past month. At 60 years old, Thomas had spent the last few weeks in Europe, attempting to escape the suffocating loneliness that seemed to permeate every corner of his vast estate. As he drove past the perfectly manicured lawns, his eyes drifted to the fountain at the center of the circular driveway. It hadn't worked in years, its stone angels covered in moss and weathered by time. Sarah had loved that fountain. She would spend hours tending to the roses that once bloomed around it, their son James playing nearby, his laughter echoing across the grounds. Now, like everything else in his life, it stood as a silent monument to what he had lost. The sun was setting as Thomas pulled up to the mansion's entrance, casting long shadows across the marble steps. Harrison, his usual caretaker, was nowhere to be seen. Something unusual but not entirely unexpected given the late hour. Thomas grabbed his briefcase from the passenger seat, his movements slow and deliberate, weighted down by the familiar heaviness that always accompanied his return home. The key turned in the lock with a heavy click that echoed through the empty foyer. Thomas stepped inside, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. The sound bounced off the high ceilings and wood-paneled walls, amplifying the solitude that awaited him. He reached for the light switch, but before his fingers could touch it, something made him freeze. A sound, soft and unfamiliar, drifted through the stillness of the house. Thomas stood perfectly still, his hand suspended in mid-air. There it was again, a quiet sob, barely audible but unmistakable in the silence of the mansion. His heart began to race, a sensation he hadn't experienced in years. The sound seemed to be coming from the main salon. Moving with cautious steps, Thomas followed the sound. The dying sunlight filtered through the grand windows, casting strange shadows across the antique furniture and Persian rugs. As he approached the salon's entrance, the sobbing grew clearer, accompanied by another sound, the subtle scraping of something against the marble floor. Thomas rounded the corner, and the sight before him made him stop dead in his tracks. There, in the middle of his grand salon, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 7 years old, her small frame hunched over as she scrubbed the floor with what appeared to be an old rag. Her clothes were worn and dirty, her dark hair falling in tangled waves around her face as she worked, unaware of his presence. The girl's hands were red and raw from cleaning, and her shoulders shook with each quiet sob she tried to suppress. Something about her vulnerability, the way she diligently worked despite her obvious distress, struck a chord deep within Thomas's chest, a place he thought had long since turned to stone. "What are you doing in my house?" His voice came out sharper than he intended, echoing off the walls like a gunshot. The girl's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. She scrambled backward, the dirty rag falling from her trembling hands. Her face, streaked with tears and smudged with dirt, held an expression that Thomas would never forget, a mixture of fear, desperation, and something else he couldn't quite place. I, she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Then, unexpectedly, instead of running away, she pointed toward the grand staircase. "Vovó," she managed to say, the Portuguese word for grandmother falling from her lips like a plea. Thomas stood frozen, his mind racing to make sense of the situation. The girl's eyes darted between him and the staircase, her small body trembling. Despite his initial anger and confusion, something made him hesitate. Perhaps it was the way she didn't try to run, or maybe it was the quiet dignity with which she had been working, even through her tears. "Show me," he found himself saying, his voice softer now. The girl blinked in surprise, then slowly rose to her feet. She kept a careful distance from him as she moved toward the staircase, her bare feet silent against the floor she had been so diligently cleaning. As they ascended the grand staircase together, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change irrevocably. The girl led the way, her small hand trailing along the dusty banister, leaving tiny fingerprints in its wake. With each step they took deeper into the mansion's upper floors, the mystery deepened, and Thomas felt an inexplicable tightening in his chest, a sensation he hadn't experienced since the day he lost everything he held dear. The second floor of the mansion was shrouded in shadows, the fading daylight barely penetrating the heavy curtains that lined the hallway. Thomas watched as the small girl navigated the corridor with surprising familiarity, leading him past closed doors and covered furniture. She moved with purpose, clearly knowing exactly where she was going, which only added to the strangeness of the situation. They stopped in front of the old guest room, the one at the far end of the east wing. Thomas hadn't opened this door in years. It held too many memories of holiday gatherings and family celebrations that now felt like scenes from someone else's life. The girl reached for the handle, and as the door swung open, the musty smell of disuse mixed with something else, the faint scent of lavender and medicine. The room was dimly lit by a small lamp on the bedside table, casting a warm glow over the scene before them. There, lying on the bed, was an elderly woman. Her silver hair was neatly braided, though her face was pale and drawn with illness. Despite the years that had passed, Thomas recognized her immediately, and the shock of recognition nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. "Antonia," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. The woman's eyes fluttered open, and a weak smile crossed her weathered face. "Senor Richardson," she said, her Portuguese accent as thick as he remembered from all those years ago. "I had hoped to be gone before you returned." The little girl rushed to the bedside, taking the old woman's hand in hers. The tenderness of the gesture struck Thomas deeply, reminding him of how James used to hold Sarah's hand during their Sunday afternoon piano sessions. "What are you doing here?" Thomas asked, struggling to keep his voice steady. "You disappeared after—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the memories threatening to overwhelm him. Antonia's eyes filled with tears. "We had nowhere else to go," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "The shelter was full, and when we found the mansion empty—" A coughing fit interrupted her words, causing the little girl to squeeze her hand tighter. "This is Isabella, my granddaughter," Antonia continued once she caught her breath. "She has been taking care of me, cleaning the house to earn our keep, even though—" Another cough shook her frail frame. Thomas looked at the girl, Isabella, with new eyes. In the better light of the bedroom, he noticed something that made his heart stop. Around her neck, partially hidden by her worn collar, was a necklace he would have recognized anywhere. The delicate gold chain supported a small pendant, a rose crafted from rose gold and diamonds, its petals catching the lamplight in a way that transported him back 25 years. "That necklace," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Where did you get it?" Isabella's hand flew to the pendant, clutching it protectively. Her eyes darted to her grandmother, who had grown noticeably pale at the mention of the jewelry. "Senor Richardson," Antonia began, her voice trembling, "there is much I need to tell you, things I should have said years ago, but fear and circumstance kept me silent." Before she could continue, another coughing fit overtook her, this one more severe than the last. Isabella immediately reached for a glass of water on the bedside table, helping her grandmother drink with a practiced care that spoke of countless similar moments. Thomas found himself moving closer to the bed, drawn by a mixture of confusion, anger, and an inexplicable sense of connection to this strange pair who had taken refuge in his home. The necklace had been Sarah's most treasured possession, a family heirloom she had planned to pass down to their children. He had assumed it had been lost in the accident, along with everything else he held dear. As he watched Isabella tend to her grandmother with such gentle determination, Thomas noticed other things too. The shape of her eyes, the way she bit her lower lip in concentration, gestures so hauntingly familiar they made his chest ache. The girl couldn't have known it, but she was unknowingly mimicking mannerisms he had spent years trying to forget. "Your silence helped no one," Thomas said quietly, his words heavy with decades of pain and loss. "Whatever you need to tell me, Antonia, I think it's long overdue." The old woman nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. "Sim, you are right. But first, you should know that everything I did, every choice I made, was out of love and Promise I made to someone who trusted me with their most precious secret. Antonia's revelation was interrupted by the sound of thunder rolling across the sky. The bedroom windows rattled slightly, and Isabella instinctively moved closer to her grandmother's bed. Thomas found himself reaching for the light switch, illuminating the room fully for the first time. In the harsh electric light, the years seemed to fall away from Antonia's face, and for a moment he saw her as she had been, the trusted housekeeper who had been more like family than employee. "Perhaps," Thomas said, his voice softer than before, "we should make you more comfortable before we continue this conversation." Despite his burning curiosity about the necklace and the countless questions swirling in his mind, he couldn't ignore Antonia's obvious distress. "Isabella, do you know where the extra blankets are kept?" The little girl nodded, surprising him again with her familiarity with the house. As she slipped out of the room, Thomas heard her bare feet pattering down the hallway. The sound stirred something in his memory, similar footsteps from long ago running through these same corridors. "She's been here for 3 weeks, Antonia said, reading the question in his eyes. "Learning every corner of this house, keeping it clean, taking care of me. She's so much like—" Her voice trailed off and she looked away, tears gathering in her eyes. "Like who, Antonia?" Thomas pressed, pulling a chair closer to the bed. "Like James?" The name of his son felt foreign on his tongue, unused for so many years. Before she could answer, Isabella returned, struggling with an armful of blankets nearly as big as she was. Without thinking, Thomas stood to help her, taking the blankets and carefully arranging them over Antonia. The girl watched him with curious eyes, no longer showing the fear from their first encounter. In the better light, he noticed a small scar above her right eyebrow, identical to the one James had gotten from falling off his bicycle when he was about her age. "Senor Richardson," Antonia began again, her voice stronger now. "Do you remember the last time you saw James? Not the day of the accident, but the last time you really spoke to him." Thomas felt his chest tighten. Of course he remembered. It had been a Tuesday evening, unseasonably warm for October. They had argued about James's choice to leave medical school, about his desire to pursue music instead. Thomas had been furious, refusing to listen to his son's explanations. The next morning, James and Sarah had left for what was supposed to be a short trip to clear the air. They never returned. "He came to me that night," Antonia continued, her words careful and measured. "He needed someone to confide in, someone who would understand." She paused, looking at Isabella, who had settled into a small chair in the corner, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. "My dear, would you go downstairs and make some tea for your grandmother?" The girl hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave Antonia's side, but eventually nodded and slipped out of the room. Thomas watched her go, struck again by the grace in her movements that reminded him so much of Sarah. Once Isabella's footsteps had faded, Antonia reached under her pillow and withdrew an envelope, yellowed with age and worn at the edges. "He left this with me, made me promise to keep it safe, to give it to you only if—" Her hands trembled as she held it out to him. Thomas took the envelope, his own hands unsteady. His name was written on the front in James's distinctive handwriting, the letters flowing and artistic, just like everything his son had created. Inside, he found several pages of careful handwriting, along with what appeared to be official documents. As he began to read, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The first lines of the letter burned themselves into his consciousness. "Dear Father, by the time you read this, everything will have changed. I need you to understand why I couldn't follow the path you chose for me. More importantly, I need you to know about Maria, about the baby, about the life I've chosen." A soft knock at the door interrupted his reading. Isabella stood in the doorway, carefully balancing a tea tray that looked far too heavy for her small frame. As she entered, the pendant around her neck caught the light again, and Thomas felt the pieces beginning to fall into place. The familiar gestures, the scar, the way she carried herself, they weren't just coincidences. "The necklace," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "James gave it to Maria, didn't he?" The question hung in the air as Isabella set down the tea tray, unaware of the weight of the moment unfolding around her. The revelation of James's letter left Thomas unable to sleep that night. After ensuring Antonia and Isabella were comfortable, in the guest room he retreated to his study, the envelope clutched in his trembling hands. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows as if nature itself was expressing the turmoil in his heart. Around midnight, a different sound caught his attention, the gentle, hesitant press of piano keys floating up. From the grand salon, Thomas rose from his leather chair, leaving the half-read letter on his desk, and followed the tentative melody. In the dim light of the salon, Isabella sat at Sarah's grand piano, her small fingers picking out a simple tune. The sight stopped Thomas in his tracks. The piano hadn't been touched in years. He had kept it covered, unable to bear the memories it held. Yet somehow, the dust cover had been removed, and in the soft glow of the security lights, he could see that the wood had been recently polished. "I'm sorry," Isabella whispered when she noticed him, quickly pulling her hands away from the keys. "I cleaned it every day, but I wasn't sure if I was allowed to play. Vovo said it needed to be touched, to be loved again." Thomas approached, slowly, not wanting to frighten her. "Do you know how to play?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been in years. Isabella shook her head. "Mama tried to teach me before." She touched the pendant at her neck, a gesture Thomas now recognized as one of comfort. "She said music was in our blood, but we never had a piano, just a small keyboard that didn't work very well." Without conscious thought, Thomas found himself sitting beside her on the bench. The familiar smell of polish and aged wood enveloped him, bringing with it a rush of memories. Sarah teaching James his first scales, family gatherings where music filled every corner of the house, lazy Sunday, afternoons when the three of them would play duets and laugh at their mistakes. "Your father," Thomas began, his fingers hovering over the keys. "He was supposed to become a doctor. That's what I wanted for him, what I had planned since the day he was born. But music..." He pressed a key, the note ringing clear and true, in the quiet room. Music was his passion, just like his mother. Isabella watched his hands with rapt attention as he began to play, muscle memory taking over as his fingers found the opening notes of Beethoven's Für Elise, the first piece James had ever mastered. "I know this one," Isabella whispered, her eyes wide with recognition. Mama used to hum it when she couldn't sleep. A tear slid down her cheek, catching the light. She said it reminded her of someone special who used to play it for her. Thomas's hands faltered on the keys. Maria, James's Maria, had known this piece because James had played it for her. How many other connections, how many other pieces of his son's life had he missed? The weight of years of willful ignorance pressed down on him, threatening to crush his heart all over again. "Would you like to learn?" he found himself asking, surprising both Isabella and himself. When she nodded eagerly, he gently positioned her small hands over the keys. "Your grandmother is right. Pianos need to be played. They need to be loved." Like people, he thought, but didn't say. As he guided her through the basic notes, Thomas noticed more details about his newfound granddaughter, the way she bit her lip in concentration, just as James had done. The slight tilt of her head as she listened to the notes, so reminiscent of Sarah. Every gesture, every expression seemed to bridge the vast chasm of loss that had defined his existence for so long. They practiced until Isabella's eyes began to droop, her small body swaying with exhaustion. Without thinking, Thomas lifted her into his arms, her head naturally finding a place on his shoulder. As he carried her up the stairs, he felt her fingers clutch the lapel of his jacket, just as James had done countless times when he was small. At the guest room door, Isabella stirred slightly. "Senor Richardson," she murmured sleepily. "The piano wasn't the only thing that needed to be loved again, was it?" Her innocent question, delivered on the edge of sleep, struck Thomas with the force of a physical blow. He looked down at her peaceful face, at the necklace that had led him to this moment, and felt something shift inside his chest, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known existed. As he tucked her into bed beside her sleeping grandmother, Thomas realized that the letter waiting in his study wasn't just a revelation of the past. It was a bridge to a future he never thought he'd have. A future that perhaps had found him precisely when he needed it most. Dawn broke over the Richardson estate, casting long shadows through the library windows where Thomas had spent the remainder of the night. James's letter lay open before him, its pages now tear-stained and wrinkled from multiple readings. Each word seemed to pierce through the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart over the past 2 decades. The letter revealed a story that shattered everything Thomas thought he knew. James had met Maria, a talented music student, during his first semester of medical school. Their connection had been immediate and profound, built on a shared passion for music that Thomas had always tried to discourage in his son. When Maria discovered she was pregnant, James had made the decision to leave medical school, determined to build a life that honored both his love for his family and his passion for music. "I know this will disappoint you, Father," James had written, "but for the first time in my life I feel truly alive. Maria and our child deserve a father who follows his heart, not someone who lives in the shadow of another's dreams." A soft knock interrupted Thomas's thoughts. Antonia stood in the doorway, looking stronger than she had the previous evening. "You've read it all?" she asked quietly, though it wasn't really a question. Thomas nodded, his voice rough with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, after the accident? You knew I had a granddaughter. You knew Maria were—" "I made a promise," Antonia interrupted, moving slowly into the room, "to both James and Maria. They wanted to tell you themselves after the baby was born. They were on their way to see you that day, to introduce you to your granddaughter, to make things right." She paused, tears flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. "When the accident happened, Maria was badly hurt but survived. The doctors said she would never fully recover. She made me promise to protect Isabella, to keep her safe until the time was right." Thomas's hands clenched into fists. "And who decided when that time would be? While I spent years drowning in grief, believing I had lost everything, my granddaughter was out there. Maria was out there." "Maria never recovered from her injuries," Antonia said softly. "She held on for 7 years, raising Isabella with every ounce of strength she had. She made sure Isabella knew about her father, about her grandmother Sarah, and about you. The necklace was her way of maintaining that connection." Before Thomas could respond, a new sound drifted through the house, Isabella's voice, singing softly as she made her way down the hallway. The melody was hauntingly familiar, an old lullaby Sarah used to sing to James. "She knows that song," Thomas whispered, his anger momentarily forgotten. Antonia smiled sadly. "Maria taught it to her. She said it was important for Isabella to know her heritage, even if circumstances kept them apart. Every night, she would tell Isabella stories about the Richardsons, about the grand house where music once filled every room, about the grandfather who loved his family so much he wanted only the best for them." The singing grew closer, and Thomas quickly wiped his eyes. Isabella appeared in the doorway, already dressed and carrying a small bucket of cleaning supplies. Even in her worn clothes, there was a dignity about her that reminded Thomas painfully of both Sarah and James. "Good morning, Senor Richardson," she said politely, though her eyes were drawn to the piano visible through the library's open doors. "I usually clean the library first before it gets too warm." Thomas looked at the cleaning supplies in her small hands, then at the letter on his desk. In that moment, the weight of 20 years of misunderstanding and loss pressed down on him with almost unbearable force. This child, his granddaughter, had been cleaning his house like a servant while carrying his family's most precious heirloom around her neck. "Isabella," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "come here, please." When she approached cautiously, he gently took the bucket from her hands and set it aside. "You don't need to clean anymore. This is—" He paused, gathering his courage. "This is your home too, if you want it to be." The little girl's eyes widened, darting between Thomas and her grandmother. "But who will take care of everything? Who will help Vovo?" "We'll hire people for that," Thomas said firmly. "Your job now is to be a child. To learn the piano if you want. To go to school. To—" His voice broke slightly. "To be part of this family again." Isabella stood very still, her hand unconsciously reaching for the necklace. "Mama said that one day I would understand why she kept this safe for me. She said it was more than just a necklace. It was a key that would open a door when the time was right. The peaceful moment in the library was shattered by the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway. Through the window, Thomas caught sight of a sleek black BMW he knew all too well. His brother Robert's arrival was as unwelcome as it was unexpected. "Isabella," Thomas said quickly, "why don't you and your grandmother go practice at the piano? I need to speak with someone." The girl nodded, sensing the tension in his voice, and quickly retreated with Antonia, closing the library doors behind them. Robert Richardson strode into the house moments later, his expensive suit and carefully styled silver hair a stark contrast to Thomas's disheveled appearance. At 55, Robert had always been the more polished of the two brothers, though his refinement masked a nature that Thomas had learned to distrust over the years. "Well, well," Robert said, his eyes scanning the room with calculated interest. "I heard from Harrison that there were some unexpected developments here. I had to see for myself." He paused, listening to the faint sound of piano notes drifting through the house. "And it seems the rumors are true. You've taken in strays." Thomas felt his jaw clench. "What are you doing here, Robert?" "Looking out for my brother's interests, of course." Robert moved to the desk, his eyes falling on James's letter. Before Thomas could stop him, he had picked it up. "What's this? Love letters from our vagrant guests?" "Put it down," Thomas growled, snatching the letter from his brother's hands. "This is none of your business." Robert's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everything about this estate is my business, Thomas. As your only living relative and legal advisor, I have a responsibility to protect your interests. And taking in homeless squatters seems very much against those interests." The sound of the piano grew louder, Isabella attempting the simple melody Thomas had taught her the night before. Robert's eyebrows rose as he listened. "Interesting choice of music," he said slowly. "That was James's favorite piece, wasn't it? Rather convenient that your little visitor seems to know it." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine at his brother's tone. "What are you implying?" "Only that grief can make people vulnerable to manipulation," Robert said smoothly. "And you've had more than your share of grief, haven't you? First Sarah and James, then that unfortunate business with their accident." "Don't," Thomas warned, his voice dangerous. "Don't talk about them." Robert held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm only trying to help. These people, this woman and child, they show up out of nowhere, make themselves at home in your house, and suddenly there's music playing again. It's all very theatrical, very calculated." "You don't know what you're talking about," Thomas said, but Robert continued as if he hadn't spoken. "I've taken the liberty of making some inquiries. Did you know that harboring undocumented squatters can result in serious legal complications? And given your position in the community, the scandal could be unfortunate." The threat in his words was unmistakable. Thomas felt his hands begin to shake, not with fear, but with a rage he hadn't experienced in years. "Get out," he said quietly. "I'll go," Robert said, straightening his tie. "But this isn't over. I'll be back tomorrow with some people from social services. For the child's protection, of course, and yours." He moved to the door, then paused. "Unless, of course, you'd like to discuss a more permanent solution to managing your estate, one that would relieve you of these burdens." After Robert left, Thomas stood at the window watching his brother's car disappear down the driveway. The piano music had stopped, and the silence felt oppressive. He knew Robert well enough to know this wasn't an idle threat. His brother had always coveted the Richardson estate and fortune, and now he sensed an opportunity to finally gain control. From the hallway came the sound of quiet sobbing. Thomas opened the library doors to find Isabella huddled against the wall, her small body shaking with tears. She had heard everything. "He wants to take me away," she whispered, looking up at Thomas with fear in her eyes. "Just like Mama said might happen. She made me promise to be brave, but I'm scared." Thomas knelt beside her, his decision already made. "No one is taking you anywhere," he said firmly. "You're a Richardson, and Richardsons protect their own." But as he held his trembling granddaughter, Thomas knew the real battle was just beginning. Robert had always been ruthless in pursuing what he wanted, and he had connections in places Thomas had never bothered to cultivate. The next 24 hours would determine not just Isabella's fate, but the future of everything Thomas had left in the world. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Thomas, spurred by Robert's threats, spent hours on the phone with his lawyers, trying to establish Isabella's legal status and protect both her and Antonia. But every conversation left him more frustrated. Without proper documentation, their position was precarious at best. As evening approached, he found himself in the mansion's dusty attic, searching through old boxes for anything that might help prove Isabella's connection to the family. The space was filled with the accumulated memories of generations of Richardsons, each trunk and container holding pieces of a past he had tried to forget. "Can I help?" a small voice asked. Thomas turned to find Isabella standing in the attic doorway, her face illuminated by the setting sun streaming through the round window. "You should be resting," he said gently, but she shook her head and stepped into the room. "Vovo is sleeping," she explained, moving carefully between the stacked boxes. "And I know where everything is up here. I cleaned it last week." She paused by a large trunk, running her hand over its leather surface. "This one has all the photo albums." Thomas stared at her in surprise. The girl's familiarity with the house continued to astonish him. She had spent weeks exploring every corner, caring for a space that, unknowingly, was part of her heritage. With her help, he began opening boxes and trunks, searching for anything that might connect the past to the present. In one dusty album, they found photographs of James's medical school graduation ceremony. Thomas hadn't attended, too angry about his son's decision to abandon medicine for music. Now, looking at the images, he noticed something he had missed before. In the background of one photo, partially hidden behind a group of students, was a young woman with dark hair and familiar eyes, Maria. "Mama," Isabella whispered, touching the photograph gently. "She looks so happy." Thomas studied the image more closely. Maria was looking at James with undisguised love, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. The timing matched. She would have been pregnant with Isabella. How had he been so blind to what was happening in his son's life? As they continued searching, Isabella pulled out a small wooden box from behind a stack of old newspapers. The box was intricately carved with musical notes, a gift Thomas had given Sarah on their first anniversary. Inside, they found a collection of letters, concert programs, and a small diary. "These are your grandmother Sarah's," Thomas explained, his voice thick with emotion. "She kept everything that was important to her in this box." He opened the diary carefully, its pages fragile with age. As he turned to the last entry, something fell out. A letter addressed to him in Sarah's handwriting, dated just days before the accident. With trembling hands, Thomas unfolded the paper. Sarah's elegant script filled the page. "My dearest Thomas, there's something you need to know about James. He came to see me yesterday, bursting with news he was afraid to share with you. You've always wanted him to find happiness, to make something meaningful of his life. What you haven't realized is that he already has. The path he's chosen isn't a rejection of your dreams for him. It's the fulfillment of his own. And soon, very soon, there will be another reason for you to be proud." The letter continued, but Thomas could barely read through his tears. Sarah had known. She had been trying to tell him about Maria, about the baby, about everything. And then the accident had taken away any chance of reconciliation. "Senor Richardson," Isabella's voice was soft, concerned. "Are you okay?" He looked at his granddaughter, seeing in her face echoes of Sarah, James, and Maria. "Yes," he said, wiping his eyes. "I'm better than okay, I'm grateful." He picked up Sarah's musical box, an idea forming. "This belonged to your grandmother Sarah, and now it belongs to you, and it might be exactly what we need." Isabella opened the box again, and this time Thomas noticed something he had missed before. Hidden in a false bottom were more documents, old photographs, letters, and most importantly, legal papers. Among them was a copy of James's will properly notarized and witnessed, naming Maria and their unborn child as his beneficiaries. "This is it," Thomas breathed. "This is what we've been looking for." The documentation might be old, but it was legitimate. It proved that James had acknowledged his child, had planned for their future. Combined with the necklace and Isabella's uncanny resemblance to both James and Sarah, it might be enough to establish her rightful place in the family. As they sat among the boxes and memories, Isabella leaned against Thomas's shoulder, her small hand finding his. "Mama said we would find answers in this house," she said quietly. She said the truth always finds a way to be heard. From somewhere downstairs came the sound of Antonia calling for Isabella, but before the girl left, she turned back to Thomas. "Will these papers stop that man from taking me away?" Thomas pulled her into a tight hug. "They'll help," he promised. "But more importantly, they prove what I already know in my heart. You belong here, Isabella, you always have." The next morning arrived with an atmosphere of nervous anticipation. Thomas had barely slept, spending most of the night organizing the documents they had found and consulting with his lawyers via email. The legal team was cautiously optimistic. The combination of James's will, Sarah's letters, and the other documentation provided a strong foundation for establishing Isabella's identity. But Thomas knew his brother well enough to know that legal arguments alone might not be sufficient. Robert had always been skilled at manipulating situations to his advantage, and his threat to involve social services wasn't idle. The thought of Isabella being taken away just when he had found her was unbearable. He was in the kitchen attempting to make breakfast for the first time in years when Harrison, his caretaker, appeared at the door. The elderly man looked troubled, his usually neat appearance somewhat disheveled. "Mr. Richardson," Harrison said, wringing his hands, "I need to speak with you." "About Mr. Robert." Thomas set down the pancake batter he had been struggling with. "What about him?" "He came to see me last week, sir. Asked questions about the house, about your habits." Harrison's voice shook slightly. "He suggested that perhaps you weren't, well, said he was worried about your state of mind living alone in this big house." The implications were clear. Robert wasn't just planning to challenge Isabella's place in the family, he was laying groundwork to question Thomas's competency. The strategy was clever. If Robert could paint Thomas as an unstable recluse making irrational decisions, it would be easier to dismiss his claims about Isabella. "Harrison," Thomas said carefully, "how long have you worked for this family?" 28 years, sir. Since before Master James was in high school. Then you remember Antonia, and you knew about James's time in medical school." Harrison's eyes widened with understanding. "Yes, sir. I remember everything, including the day Miss Maria came to visit James here. They thought no one saw them, but—" He paused, a small smile crossing his face. "They were so in love, sir, just like you and Mrs. Sarah had been." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the driveway. Through the kitchen window, he could see Robert's BMW, along with two other official-looking vehicles. His brother had arrived, and he hadn't come alone. "Harrison," Thomas said quickly, "go find Antonia and Isabella. Take them to the music room and stay with them. Don't let anyone in unless I'm present." As Harrison hurried away, Thomas straightened his shoulders and walked to the front door. He opened it just as Robert was raising his hand to knock. Behind him stood a woman in a severe suit, who Thomas assumed was from social services, and a man who could only be a lawyer, judging by his briefcase and calculating expression. "Good morning, brother," Robert said smoothly. "I believe I mentioned I would be bringing some concerned parties to discuss the situation. Did you also mention to them that you're trying to seize control of the estate?" Thomas asked, his voice cold. "Or that you've been laying groundwork to question my mental competency?" The social worker looked startled, but Robert's smile didn't waver. "You see," he said to his companions, "paranoid accusations. This is exactly what I was talking about. Living alone in this mausoleum has clearly affected his judgment." "Mr. Richardson," the social worker began, "we're only here to ensure the welfare of the child. If there are undocumented minors being kept in this house—" "My granddaughter," Thomas interrupted, "is exactly where she belongs, and I have documentation to prove it." He held up the folder containing the papers from Sarah's box. "Including my son's legal will and other evidence establishing her identity." For the first time, Robert's confident expression faltered. He clearly hadn't expected Thomas to have any legal documentation, but he recovered quickly, reaching into his own briefcase. "How convenient that these documents suddenly appear," he said smoothly. But I have some papers of my own, concerning the accident that claimed James's life. Papers that raise some very interesting questions about what really happened that day. Thomas felt his blood run cold. The threat in Robert's words was clear, but there was something else, a hint of knowledge that suggested his brother knew more about the accident than he had ever let on. As thunder rumbled in the distance, Thomas realized that the real storm was only beginning to gather. The tension in Thomas's study was palpable as Robert spread several documents across the mahogany desk. The social worker and lawyer sat nearby, their expressions carefully neutral, as they observed the unfolding drama between the brothers. Outside, the threatening storm had begun to release its first heavy drops of rain against the windows. "You see," Robert began, his voice carrying a note of calculated concern, "I've been investigating the circumstances surrounding James's accident for years. Out of worry for you, of course, dear brother." He selected a particular document and slid it forward. This police report contained some interesting discrepancies that were never fully explained. Thomas picked up the report with trembling hands. As he read, his face grew increasingly pale. The report detailed witness statements about a second car that had been seen following James and Sarah's vehicle shortly before the accident, a detail that had somehow been omitted from the final investigation. "What is this, Robert?" Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. "Just some facts that might be relevant to our current situation," Robert replied smoothly, especially considering how James had been acting in the days before the accident. Making changes to his will, withdrawing large sums of money, behaving erratically. The social worker leaned forward. "I'm not sure I understand how this relates to the child currently in question." Robert's smile was cold. "It speaks to patterns of behavior in our family. My brother, grieving and isolated, suddenly accepts an outlandish story about a long-lost granddaughter. Meanwhile, I have evidence suggesting that James's accident might not have been an accident at all. Perhaps he was running from something or someone." "That's enough." Thomas slammed his hand on the desk, causing everyone to jump. "You've always been manipulative, Robert, but this is low even for you." A small sound from the doorway made them all turn. Isabella stood there, her face white, clutching Sarah's musical box to her chest. Behind her, Harrison looked apologetic. "I'm sorry, sir," the caretaker said. "She insisted on bringing this to you, said it was important." Thomas started to speak, but Isabella stepped forward, her chin raised despite her obvious fear. With deliberate movements, she opened the box and reached into the false bottom, pulling out not just the documents they had found earlier, but something else. A small tape recorder, old, but apparently well preserved. "Mama said this was important, too," she said quietly. "She said I should only play it if someone tried to take me away from my real family." Robert's face changed almost imperceptibly. "A child's imagination," he said quickly. "Surely we're not going to listen to—" But Isabella had already pressed play. The room filled with a voice that made Thomas's heart stop. James's voice, recorded days before the accident. "If anything happens to me," the recording began, "this is my testimony. Robert came to see me yesterday. He knows about Maria, about the baby. He threatened to expose everything to Father in the worst possible way unless I sign over my inheritance rights. He said he'd make sure Father never accepted my child into the family." The recording continued, detailing a meeting at a cafe where Robert had laid out his threats. James had secretly recorded everything, including Robert's thinly veiled suggestions about what might happen if James didn't comply. "I won't let him win," James's voice continued. "Maria and I are going to tell Father everything tomorrow. We're bringing all the evidence, including this recording. If you're hearing this, it means something went wrong. Protect my child. And Father, I hope someday you understand why I had to follow my heart." The tape clicked to a stop. In the silence that followed, the sound of rain seemed deafening. The social worker and lawyer exchanged glances, their professional detachment cracking in the face of this unexpected revelation. Robert stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This proves nothing," he snarled, but his usual polish had cracked, revealing something uglier beneath. Her decades-old recording could easily be fabricated, and even if it were real, it doesn't change the fact that this child has no legal standing. "Actually," the lawyer interrupted, examining James's will and the other documents Thomas had provided. These papers appear quite legitimate. Combined with this recording and the physical evidence, he glanced meaningfully at Isabella, whose resemblance to the Richardson family was undeniable. I would say there's more than enough here to establish the child's identity and rights. The social worker nodded in agreement. Our concern was for the child's welfare. If Mr. Richardson can provide a stable home environment, and given the evidence of her legitimate claim to be here— "This isn't over," Robert snapped, gathering his papers with shaking hands. But as he moved toward the door, Harrison stepped forward. "Mr. Robert," the old caretaker said quietly, "I think there's something else you should know. I've worked here for nearly 3 decades. I saw everything that happened in those days, including where you went after visiting Master James at that cafe." Harrison's words hung in the air like a physical presence. Robert had frozen in the doorway, his back rigid with tension. The caretaker's normally gentle face had hardened with a determination that transformed him. "I followed you that day," Harrison continued, his voice gaining strength. "I saw you meet with someone in a black car, the same car that witnesses reported seeing before the accident. I kept quiet all these years out of fear, but I can't anymore. Not when an innocent child's future is at stake." Robert spun around, his composure completely shattered. "You can't prove anything." But his voice held a note of desperation that betrayed him. The social worker stood, her professional demeanor now tinged with obvious disapproval. "Mr. Robert Richardson, I think it would be best if you left. We'll be making note of these allegations in our report, and I suspect the proper authorities will want to investigate further." "This is absurd," Robert sputtered. "You're all being manipulated by a child's story and some convenient evidence that suddenly appears—" "The evidence didn't suddenly appear," Thomas interrupted, moving to stand beside Isabella. "It was here all along, waiting for the right moment. Just like my granddaughter." He placed a protective hand on Isabella's shoulder. "James and Maria knew what kind of man you were. They prepared for the worst, even while hoping for the best." The lawyer was already pulling out his phone. "I should contact the police. These allegations about the accident need to be properly investigated." Robert's face had gone ashen. Without another word, he turned and fled from the room. They heard his footsteps pounding down the hallway, followed by the distant slam of the front door and the squeal of tires on wet pavement. In the sudden quiet, Isabella's small voice broke the tension. "Is it over?" she asked, looking up at Thomas. "Can I stay?" Thomas knelt down to her level, noting how her hand still clutched Sarah's musical box. "Yes, sweetheart. You can stay. This is your home now. It always should have been." The social worker approached them, her severe expression softened. "We'll need to process some paperwork to formalize everything, but given the documentation and circumstances, I see no reason why Mr. Richardson shouldn't be granted immediate temporary custody, leading to permanent guardianship." As the professionals discussed details, Antonia appeared in the doorway, supported by Harrison. Her face was wet with tears, but her eyes shone with relief and vindication. "I kept my promise, Maria," she whispered. "Your daughter is home." Later that evening, after all the officials had left and the household had settled into an exhausted calm, Thomas found Isabella in the music room. She sat at the piano, Sarah's musical box open beside her, sorting through the old photographs and letters they had discovered. "Your grandmother Sarah wrote something else in her final letter," Thomas said, sitting beside her on the bench. "She said that music has a way of healing wounds that nothing else can touch." He placed his hands on the keys, beginning the gentle melody of Für Elise. "Would you like to learn the rest of it?" Isabella nodded, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. As grandfather and granddaughter played together, the storm outside began to clear, and the last rays of sunset broke through the clouds, filling the room with golden light. From her bed upstairs, Antonia listened to the music floating up through the house. For the first time in decades, the mansion felt alive again, its rooms and hallways filled with the sounds of family, of healing, of hope. She touched the cross at her neck and said a quiet prayer of thanks. In his study, Harrison carefully filed away the evidence they had uncovered, along with his own detailed statement about what he had witnessed all those years ago. The truth about the accident would finally come to light, bringing closure to wounds that had festered for far too long. And in the music room, Thomas watched his granddaughter's small fingers finding their way across the keys, each note a step toward healing, each melody a bridge between past and future. The necklace that had led him to this moment caught the last light of day, its rose-gold petals seeming to glow with an inner fire. "Your mother would be proud," he said softly, "and your father. He would be overjoyed to see you here, making this house come alive again." Isabella leaned against his shoulder, her fingers still resting on the keys. "Mama said that love finds a way to bring families together, even when everything seems lost." Thomas smiled, his heart full. "Your mama was a very wise woman, and she raised an extraordinary daughter." The days following Robert's dramatic exit brought a flurry of changes to the Richardson mansion. Thomas, with a renewed sense of purpose, threw himself into creating a proper home for Isabella. The guest room she and Antonia had been using was quickly transformed into a cheerful bedroom, with walls painted in soft yellow and furniture chosen by Isabella herself. One morning, as sunshine streamed through newly washed windows, Thomas found himself standing in the doorway of what had once been James's room. He hadn't entered it in years, but now, watching Isabella arrange her books on the shelves, he felt the weight of those memories shifting, transforming from burden to blessing. "Senor Richardson," Isabella called from inside the room, "I found something behind the bookshelf." She held up a dusty notebook, its pages yellowed with age. Thomas crossed the room and took the notebook gently. Opening it, he recognized James's handwriting immediately. It was his old composition book, filled with half-finished musical scores and lyrics. Some of the pages were marked with coffee stains and enthusiastic annotations in a different handwriting. Maria's, he realized with a start. "Your parents wrote music together," he said softly, running his fingers over the faded ink. "Your father would compose the melodies, and your mother would help with the lyrics." He turned a page and smiled. "Look at this one. They called it Rose Gold Love and probably inspired by your grandmother's necklace." Isabella touched the pendant at her neck, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Can we play it?" Before Thomas could answer, Harrison appeared at the door. "Mr. Richardson, the police are here. They'd like to speak with you about Mr. Robert." Thomas's heart tightened, but he managed to keep his voice steady. "Isabella, why don't you take this downstairs and show it to your grandmother? Maybe she can help you understand some of the Portuguese lyrics your mother wrote." After Isabella left, clutching the precious notebook, Thomas made his way to his study where two detectives waited. Their expressions were grave but professional. "Mr. Richardson," the older detective began, "we've located your brother. He was attempting to book a flight to South America." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "More importantly, we've found some very interesting financial records in his office. It seems he's been maintaining a separate account since 1999, the year of your son's accident." Thomas sank into his chair, his legs suddenly weak. He really did it, didn't he? He was responsible for what happened to James and Sarah. The detective nodded slowly. "We've found evidence suggesting he hired someone to follow your son's car. So that day, the plan wasn't to cause a fatal accident, just to scare them, to prevent them from reaching you with the news about Maria and the baby. But things went wrong." A wave of nausea washed over Thomas. All these years, Robert had sat across from him at family dinners, had pretended to share his grief, all while knowing he was responsible for the tragedy that had torn their family apart. "There's something else," the younger detective added, pulling out a folder. "We found this in Robert's personal safe. It's a private investigator's report from 6 years ago. He knew about Isabella, Mr. Richardson. He knew Maria had survived and had your granddaughter. He's been monitoring them all this time, making sure they never found their way back to you." The revelation hit Thomas like a physical blow. Robert hadn't just caused the accident, he had actively worked to keep Isabella from her rightful family for years. The magnitude of his brother's betrayal was almost incomprehensible. From downstairs came the sound of music, Isabella at the piano picking out the melody from James's notebook, while Antonia's voice provided the Portuguese lyrics. The simple, beautiful notes of Rose Gold Love floated up the stairs, a reminder that despite Robert's best efforts, love and truth had found their way home. "We'll need statements from everyone," the detective was saying, "including Isabella and Mrs. Antonia when they're ready. But given the evidence we've already uncovered, your brother will be facing serious charges." Thomas nodded, his mind already turning to the future. "What do I need to do to ensure Isabella is protected? To make sure nothing like this can ever threaten her again?" The younger detective smiled. "The documentation you provided, combined with the DNA test results that just came back, establishes her identity beyond any doubt. She's legally your granddaughter, Mr. Richardson. No one can change that now." After the detectives left, Thomas remained in his study, processing everything he had learned. The sound of the piano continued, joined now by Isabella's clear voice as she grew more confident with the melody. Her father's music, her mother's words brought back to life through their daughter. Harrison appeared with a cup of tea, his presence as steady and reassuring as ever. "She's blossoming, sir," the old caretaker observed, "like those roses Mrs. Sarah used to tend, the ones you thought would never bloom again." Thomas looked out the window at the overgrown garden where Sarah's roses had once flourished. Perhaps it was time to bring those back to life too. After all, he had a family to create new memories with now. The garden of the Richardson estate came alive with activity on a bright Saturday morning. Thomas, directed by an enthusiastic Isabella, was clearing away years of overgrowth from Sarah's beloved rose beds. Harrison moved carefully among the flowering bushes, his experienced hands pruning and shaping with practiced ease. "Mama said the roses here were magical," Isabella commented, holding a watering can almost as big as she was. "She said they bloomed in winter once, just because Grandmother Sarah wanted them to." Thomas paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow. "Your grandmother did have a special touch with these flowers. She always said that roses, like people, need love and patience to reach their full potential." He looked at the tangled bushes they were gradually restoring. "I'm afraid I haven't shown much of either since she left us." Antonia watched from her comfortable chair on the patio, her health improving day by day in the peaceful atmosphere of her new home. The legal paperwork making her Isabella's co-guardian alongside Thomas had been finalized the previous day, ensuring that the girl would always have the connection to her mother's heritage as well as her father's. "Maria would be so happy," Antonia said softly, her eyes following Isabella as she carefully watered each rosebush. She never wanted Isabella to have to choose between her two families. She wanted her to have both, the music of the Richardsons and the heart of Brazil. As if in response to her words, the sound of a delivery truck approaching caught their attention. Thomas straightened up, a smile spreading across his face. "Perfect timing," he said mysteriously. The delivery men carefully maneuvered a large object through the mansion's front door. Isabella's eyes widened as she realized what it was: a brand new baby grand piano, its polished surface gleaming in the morning light. "The old one in the music room was your father's practice piano," Thomas explained, leading her inside. "This one is yours, for your lessons and for creating your own music, just like your parents did." Isabella ran her fingers reverently over the keys, producing a clear, perfect note. "Can we play their song on it, the one from the notebook?" Thomas sat beside her on the bench, just as he had that first night when everything changed. "Of course. But first, there's something else I want to show you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a formal document, papers officially changing Isabella's last name to Richardson, while keeping her mother's family name as well. "You don't have to choose," he said gently. "You can be both, just like your grandmother said." Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes as she read the document. "Like the roses," she whispered, "growing in two directions but from the same roots." They spent the afternoon at the piano, Thomas teaching Isabella the proper fingering for rose gold love, while Antonia helped with the Portuguese pronunciation of Maria's lyrics. The song filled the mansion with its bittersweet melody, a bridge between past and present, loss and renewal. Harrison, bringing in fresh flowers from the garden, paused in the doorway to listen. The music reminded him of earlier days when James would practice for hours while Sarah tended her roses. But now there was something new in the familiar notes: hope, healing, and the promise of tomorrow. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the music room windows, Thomas watched his granddaughter play. The rose-gold pendant at her neck caught the light, seeming to glow with an inner fire. In that moment, he could almost feel Sarah and James's presence, could almost hear Maria's voice joining their daughters. "You know," he said during a pause in the music, "your grandmother Sarah once told me that every ending holds the seeds of a new beginning." I didn't understand what she meant until now. Isabella looked up at him, her fingers still resting on the keys. "Because sometimes the best things in life grow from the hardest moments, like roses growing through thorns." Thomas smiled, marveling at his granddaughter's wisdom. "Exactly like that. And sometimes it takes a special kind of love to help those roses bloom." The transformation of the Richardson mansion continued as summer approached. The once silent halls now echoed with the sound of Isabella's footsteps and the gentle melodies that floated from the music room at all hours. Thomas had hired the best piano teacher in the city, and his granddaughter's natural talent, inherited from both James and Maria, was beginning to shine through. One particularly warm afternoon, Thomas sat in his study, reviewing the final paperwork from his lawyers. Robert had been formally charged, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. The investigators had uncovered a trail of deception that spanned decades, including surveillance reports on Maria and Isabella that made Thomas's blood boil with anger. A knock at the door interrupted his dark thoughts. Isabella stood there, wearing a new dress that Antonia had helped her choose, her father's old composition book clutched to her chest. "Vovô," she said hesitantly, using the Portuguese word for grandfather for the first time. "Can I show you something?" Thomas's heart swelled at the term of endearment. "Of course, sweetheart, come in." Isabella approached his desk and opened the notebook to a blank page near the back. There, in careful handwriting, she had begun composing her own music. The notes were simple but deliberate, and Thomas could see James's influence in the way she structured the melody. "It's a song for all of us," she explained, pointing to the title, "Family Garden. See, this part here is for Grandmother Sarah's roses, and this is for Mama's voice, and this part—" She hummed a few notes. "This is for the way you and Papa both love the piano." Thomas studied the composition, noting how she had woven together different musical themes, creating something entirely new, yet somehow familiar. "It's beautiful, Isabella. Would you play it for me?" They moved to the music room together, where the late afternoon sun streamed through newly installed stained glass windows, another touch that Sarah had always wanted, but never got around to adding. As Isabella began to play her composition, Thomas noticed Antonia and Harrison quietly entering the room, drawn by the music. The melody started softly, like the first buds of spring, then gradually built into something more complex and beautiful. Thomas could hear echoes of the lullabies Sarah used to sing, the classical pieces James had loved, and the Brazilian rhythms that must have filled Isabella's early years with Maria. As she played, Thomas glanced around the room, taking in all the changes that had occurred in just a few short months. The heavy drapes had been replaced with light, airy curtains that billowed in the warm breeze. Fresh flowers, including Sarah's beloved roses, filled crystal vases on every surface. Photos of James, Sarah, and Maria now hung proudly on the walls, no longer hidden away in dusty albums. But the most significant change wasn't in the physical space, it was in the people who inhabited it. Harrison stood straighter these days, pride evident in his bearing, as he helped restore the mansion to its former glory. Antonia's health had improved dramatically, her face glowing with happiness as she watched her granddaughter thrive. And Thomas himself felt decades younger, as if the weight of grief and loneliness had finally lifted from his shoulders. Isabella's song came to an end, the final notes lingering in the air like perfume from the garden. In the silence that followed, Thomas noticed tears on Antonia's cheeks. "That was the greatest gift you could have given us," she said softly. "A song that brings everyone together, that honors all the love that came before." Thomas moved to the piano bench and sat beside his granddaughter. Your father once told me that music has the power to heal what words cannot touch. I didn't understand then, but I do now. He pulled her into a gentle hug. Thank you for bringing music back into this house, sweetheart. Isabella leaned against him, her small hand finding his. Mama always said that love is like a garden. It needs care and attention, but it can bloom anywhere, even in the most unexpected places. From outside came the sound of birds singing in the restored garden, their melodies joining with the lingering echoes of Isabella's composition. The grandfather clock in the hallway, recently repaired and restored to working order, chimed the hour, a sound that had once marked lonely minutes, but now signaled moments shared with family. Speaking of gardens, Thomas said, reaching into his desk drawer, I have something to show you too. He pulled out a set of architectural drawings. I've been working with a designer to convert part of the garden into a proper performance space. A place where we can share music with others, just like your parents would have wanted. The plans for the garden performance space quickly became a family project. Isabella spent hours with the designers, sharing her ideas about where the stage should be placed and how the seating should be arranged. Her suggestions, though coming from a child's perspective, showed remarkable insight into how music and nature could work together. The roses should be here, she explained one evening, pointing to the architectural drawings spread across the dining room table. So when people listen to the music, they can smell Grandmother Sarah's flowers too. Thomas watched in amazement as his granddaughter confidently discussed acoustic design with the architects. She had inherited not just her father's musical talent, but also Sarah's eye for beauty and Maria's practical wisdom. The combination was extraordinary. As summer progressed, the construction began. The back garden was transformed into an intimate amphitheater with curved seating areas nestled among the flower beds. Sarah's roses, now thriving under the careful attention of Harrison and Isabella, would indeed frame the stage just as his granddaughter had envisioned. One evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of rose gold, Thomas found Isabella sitting on the partially completed stage, her feet dangling over the edge. She was holding her mother's necklace, lost in thought. Are you all right, sweetheart? He asked, joining her. Isabella nodded slowly. I was just thinking about what Mama would say if she could see all this. She always told me that music should be shared, that it's a gift that grows bigger when you give it away. Thomas put his arm around her shoulders. She was absolutely right, and that's exactly what this place will be. A gift to share with others. He paused, gathering his thoughts. You know, I spent so many years keeping everything locked away. The music, the memories, the love. I thought I was protecting myself from more pain, but really I was just preventing any healing from happening. Like keeping the roses locked behind the garden gate, Isabella asked, showing her uncanny ability to understand complex emotions. Exactly like that. But you and Antonia changed everything. You showed me that love isn't something to hide away. It's something to nurture and share even when it seems impossible. From inside the house came the sound of Antonia calling them for dinner. As they walked back hand in hand, Thomas noticed a small cluster of rosebuds emerging from one of the newly planted bushes. White roses, with just a hint of pink at their edges, exactly like the ones Sarah had loved most. The dining room, once a formal space used only for occasional business dinners, had become the heart of their home. Antonia had introduced Brazilian dishes to their meals, and the blend of cultures and flavors seemed to symbolize their newly formed family, different elements coming together to create something uniquely beautiful. As they ate, Harrison shared updates about the garden's progress. The acoustics experts say it's perfect, he reported. Something about the way the stone walls curve and the placement of the trees. The sound will carry beautifully. Then I think it's time we started planning the opening concert, Thomas said, watching Isabella's eyes light up. Your composition should be the centerpiece, sweetheart. Family garden, the perfect way to inaugurate the space. Really? Isabella asked, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. But what if I'm not ready? Antonia reached across the table to squeeze her granddaughter's hand. My dear, you were born ready. You carry the music of 3 generations in your heart. When you play, we can hear all of them, Sarah's grace, James's passion, and Maria's joy. Later that night, after Isabella had gone to bed, Thomas stood at his study window looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight. The half-finished performance space seemed to glow with possibility. Soon it would be filled with music, with people, with life. Everything his son and daughter-in-law had dreamed of creating. He thought about Robert, now facing justice for his actions, and felt only sadness for the brother who had let greed poison his heart. But even that dark chapter had led to something beautiful. It had brought Isabella home, had forced the truth into the light, had allowed healing to finally begin. The sound of soft piano notes drifted up from below. Isabella practicing despite the late hour, her dedication reminiscent of James's own passionate pursuit of music. Thomas closed his eyes and listened, hearing in her playing echoes of all the love stories that had led to this moment. Sarah and her roses, James and Maria's forbidden romance, and now the unexpected blessing of a grandfather finding his way back to life through his granddaughter's heart. As the date of the inaugural concert approached, the Richardson estate buzzed with activity. The garden performance space was nearly complete, its elegant design seamlessly blending with the restored rose gardens. Every morning, Isabella would inspect the progress, often accompanied by Harrison, who had taken on the role of project supervisor with remarkable enthusiasm. One particularly busy morning, Thomas found himself sorting through a box of old programs from concerts where James had performed. He planned to create a display for the opening night, honoring the musical legacy that had led to this moment. Among the yellowed papers, he discovered something unexpected, a manuscript he didn't recognize. "Isabella," he called out, his voice trembling slightly. "Could you come here for a moment?" His granddaughter appeared in the doorway of his study, her practice clothes slightly dusty from helping Harrison in the garden. When Thomas showed her the manuscript, her eyes widened in recognition. "That's Mama's handwriting," she whispered, touching the pages gently. She used to write in that special purple ink. The manuscript was titled Symphony of Secrets, dated just weeks before the accident. As they examined it together, they realized it was a collaborative piece, James's music interwoven with Maria's lyrics, creating a complex narrative about forbidden love, hidden truths, and the power of forgiveness. "They never got to perform it," Thomas said softly, reading through the notes. "This must have been what they were bringing to show me, along with the news about you." Isabella studied the music intently, her finger tracing the notes on the page. "Vovo, I think we should perform this at the concert. Not just my piece, but this one too. It's like they wrote it for this moment." Thomas felt tears welling in his eyes. "Are you sure you're ready for something this complex?" His granddaughter's chin lifted in a gesture that reminded him so much of Sarah. "Mama always said that when love guides your hands, anything is possible." She paused, then added, "And I won't be playing alone. You'll be there with me." The next few weeks became a whirlwind of preparation. Isabella spent every spare moment practicing, her dedication touching everyone who heard her. The piece was challenging, requiring both technical skill and emotional depth, but she approached it with a maturity that belied her years. Antonia contributed by sharing stories about Maria's time with James, helping Isabella understand the emotions behind the music. "Your mother would spend hours getting the lyrics just right," she recalled. "She said each word needed to carry not just meaning, but memory." Harrison, meanwhile, had made it his personal mission to ensure the garden would be perfect for the performance. He worked tirelessly with the landscapers, insisting that every detail align with Sarah's original vision for the space. The roses especially received his devoted attention, as if he understood their significance to the family's story. One evening, about a week before the concert, Thomas was surprised by the arrival of a package from the police department. Inside were items recovered from Robert's office, including a diary that had belonged to Maria. The accompanying note explained that it had been among the evidence collected during the investigation. Thomas called Isabella and Antonia to his study, and together they opened the diary. Maria's words painted a vivid picture of her life with James, their dreams for their child, and their hope for reconciliation with Thomas. The final entry, dated the day before the accident, was particularly poignant. Tomorrow we tell James's father everything. I'm nervous, but also hopeful. James says his father has a good heart, that he just needs to understand that love sometimes chooses its own path. We'll play him our symphony, let him hear how we've woven our lives together through music. And then we'll tell him about our precious daughter, how she already shows signs of having both our passions. I pray he'll see that some things are meant to be, even if they don't follow the expected path. As Thomas read these words aloud, his voice thick with emotion, Isabella moved to the piano. Without saying anything, she began to play the opening, notes of Symphony of Secrets. The melody seemed to bring Maria's words to life, filling the study with all the hope and love her parents had felt on that fateful day. Antonia wiped tears from her eyes. They knew, she said softly. They knew that music would eventually bridge all the gaps between hearts. They just didn't know it would take this long. Thomas watched his granddaughter play, her small fingers moving confidently over the keys. In her face he could see both James and Maria, their love story continuing through their daughter. The symphony they had written was more than just a piece of music. It was a message sent through time, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The night before the concert, a gentle rain fell over the Richardson estate, as if nature itself was helping to prepare the garden for its moment of transformation. Thomas couldn't sleep, his mind filled with memories and anticipation. He found himself wandering down to the music room, where a surprising sight greeted him. Isabella sat at the piano in her nightgown, not playing, but simply running her fingers over the keys. In the soft light, the rose-gold pendant at her neck seemed to glow, creating a small rainbow on the polished wood surface. Couldn't sleep either? Thomas asked softly, joining her on the bench. Isabella shook her head. I was thinking about tomorrow, about Mama and Papa. Vovo told me that Papa used to get nervous before performances too. She said he would sit just like this, touching the keys without playing them. Thomas smiled, remembering how James would pace the music room the night before a concert, his nervous energy filling the house. Your father believed that every performance was a chance to touch someone's heart. He used to say that when you play with love, the music finds its way to the people who need it most. Is that why you stayed away from music for so long? Isabella asked, her question carrying the innocent wisdom that often surprised him. Because it touched your heart too much? Thomas was quiet for a moment, considering her words. I was afraid, he admitted finally, afraid of feeling everything the music would make me feel. But you taught me that those feelings, even the painful ones, are part of what makes life beautiful. From the doorway came Antonia's voice. Maria used to say something similar. She believed that music was God's way of helping us understand emotions too deep for words. She entered the room slowly, carrying something in her hands, a small ornate box that Thomas had never seen before. I've been waiting for the right moment to share this, she said, sitting in a nearby chair. Maria left it with me to give to Isabella when she was ready. The box contained a collection of small treasures, a dried rose from the Richardson garden, ticket stubs from James's performances, a small sketch of Sarah that James had drawn, and most precious of all, a letter addressed to my darling daughter. As Isabella read the letter silently, tears rolling down her cheeks, Thomas and Antonia exchanged glances. They had both played their parts in protecting this child, in keeping alive the love story that had created her, and now they were watching her embrace her full heritage. Mama knew, Isabella said finally, looking up from the letter. She knew that someday I would find my way here, that music would bring us all together again. She wrote about the symphony, about how she and Papa put all their hopes for the future into it. She paused, touching the rose-gold pendant. She said that love, like music, always finds its home. Thomas wrapped an arm around his granddaughter's shoulders, marveling at how this small person had brought so much healing to their broken family. Your mother was right, and tomorrow we'll share that love with others. Your parents' symphony, your family garden piece, they're both parts of the same story. Harrison appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with hot chocolate for everyone. It was well past midnight, but none of them seemed ready to sleep. They sat together in the music room, sharing memories and hopes, while the rain outside created its own gentle melody. "You know," Harrison said thoughtfully, "in all my years of service to this family, I've never seen the house feel more alive than it does now. It's as if every room is breathing again, every corner filled with possibility." Antonia nodded in agreement. "That's what love does. It brings life back to places that have forgotten how to live." As they talked, Isabella began to play softly. Not her parents' symphony or her own composition, but something new, something that seemed to flow naturally from her fingers. The melody carried echoes of all the pieces of her heritage: her father's classical training, her mother's Brazilian rhythms, her grandmother Sarah's love of romantic compositions, all woven together into something uniquely her own. Thomas listened, realizing that this impromptu midnight concert was just as important as the formal performance they would give tomorrow. This was music in its purest form, born of love, shaped by memory, and shared in the quiet moments between night and dawn. The day of the concert arrived with perfect weather, as if nature itself had conspired to make the evening magical. The garden performance space, now complete, was a vision of elegance and beauty. White chairs were arranged in graceful curves. Around the stage, while Sarah's roses in full bloom created a natural backdrop that seemed to glow in the late afternoon sun. Inside the mansion, Isabella stood before her mirror, wearing a dress that Antonia had specially made for the occasion. The pale blue fabric complemented the rose gold pendant at her neck, and her dark hair had been arranged in a style that reminded Thomas startlingly of Maria. "Your mother wore her hair exactly like that for her first professional performance," he told her, standing in the doorway of her room. James couldn't take his eyes off her. Isabella touched the pendant, a gesture that had become her way of connecting with her parents' memory. "Do you think they'll be able to hear us tonight, Vovo? Their symphony finally being played?" Thomas knelt beside her, taking her small hands in his. "Love doesn't need ears to hear, sweetheart. They're here with us, in every note you play, in every rose that blooms, in every smile you share." The sound of arriving cars drifted up from the driveway. The guests were beginning to arrive. Musicians from the city orchestra, who had helped prepare the symphony, former colleagues of James from medical school, old friends of the family who had known Sarah, and even some of Maria's friends from the music conservatory, who had traveled from Brazil for the occasion. Harrison had outdone himself with the preparations. The garden paths were lined with soft lights that would illuminate as darkness fell, and the stage was set with two grand pianos, the restored one that had been James's, and Isabella's newer one, positioned so grandfather and granddaughter could perform together. As the sun began to set, Thomas stood at the podium to address the gathered crowd. The garden was full, with people seated not just in the chairs, but on blankets spread across the lawn. The atmosphere was one of anticipation and joy. 25 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "This garden was my wife Sarah's pride and joy. She believed that beauty could heal any wound, that love could bridge any gap. Today we celebrate not just the restoration of her garden, but the restoration of our family's heart." He gestured to Isabella, who walked confidently to her piano. "My granddaughter will perform two pieces tonight. The first is her own composition, Family Garden, written as a tribute to all the love stories that have shaped her life. The second is a previously undiscovered work called Symphony of Secrets, composed by her parents, James and Maria Richardson, in what would prove to be their final collaboration. As Isabella began to play her piece, a hush fell over the crowd. The melody started softly, like the first tentative notes of dawn, then gradually built into something more complex and beautiful. Thomas could see people in the audience wiping away tears as they recognized the various themes woven throughout. Classical pieces that Sarah had loved, Brazilian rhythms that spoke of Maria's heritage, and original passages that could only have come from James's influence. The roses seemed to sway gently in the evening breeze, their perfume mixing with the music to create an almost magical atmosphere. As the piece reached its crescendo, the garden lights gradually illuminated, creating a soft golden glow that mirrored the emotions in the music. When the final notes of Family Garden faded away, There was a moment of profound silence before the applause began. Thomas watched his granddaughter acknowledge the approval with a graceful bow, just as her father would have done. Then it was time for Symphony of Secrets. Thomas joined Isabella at the second piano, and together they began to play the piece that James and Maria had created as their testament of love. The music told their story, the young medical student falling in love with the Brazilian music student, their shared passion for music overwhelming all obstacles, their dream of uniting their different worlds through love and harmony. As they played, Thomas glanced at his granddaughter, seeing in her face the same intense concentration he had so often seen in James's. But there was something else too, a joy, a freedom in her expression that spoke of Maria's influence. She wasn't just playing the music. She was living it, breathing it, making it her own. The Symphony of Secrets filled the garden with its powerful narrative, each movement revealing another layer of James and Maria's love story. In the audience, those who had known them were visibly moved, recognizing the personalities of both, composers in every phrase and transition. Antonia, seated in the front row, clutched a handkerchief as she watched her granddaughter bring her parents' final work to life. Beside her, Harrison stood at attention, his usual professional demeanor softened by evident emotion. Both of them had played crucial roles in preserving this legacy until the right moment arrived for it to be shared. As the symphony reached its final movement, something extraordinary happened. A warm breeze swept through the garden, carrying the scent of roses, and for a moment, the stage seemed to be bathed in a peculiar golden light. Later, many guests would speak of this moment, describing it as if a veil between past and present had briefly lifted. The final notes of the symphony rang out clear and true across the garden, hanging in the air like stars. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the weight of everything the music had expressed: love, loss, hope, and ultimately, redemption. Then the applause began, starting slowly and building to a thunderous ovation. People rose to their feet, many, with tears streaming down their faces. Thomas and Isabella stood together at their pianos, holding hands as they acknowledged the response. But it was what happened next that truly captured the evening's spirit. Without any prompting, Isabella stepped forward and began to play again. This time, a simple, heartfelt rendition of Fur-Elise, the first piece her father had mastered, and the one that had initially connected her with Thomas. As she played, she spoke to the audience, her voice clear and confident. "This was the first piece my father learned to play. It was also the first piece I learned here in this house with my grandfather. Sometimes love takes a long time to find its way home, but when it does, it brings music with it." Thomas watched his granddaughter, marveling at how she had transformed from the frightened little girl he'd found cleaning his floors into this poised young musician. The rose gold pendant at her neck caught the garden lights, seeming to pulse with its own inner radiance. After the performance, as guests mingled in the illuminated garden, many approached to share their memories of James and Maria. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of their life together, helping Isabella understand the depth of her parents' love story. One elderly professor from the medical school approached Thomas with tears in his eyes. "I always regretted not speaking up when James left medical school," he admitted. "I saw how music lit him up in a way medicine never did. Watching your granddaughter tonight, I understood even better. Some passions are meant to be followed." As the evening drew to a close, Thomas found Isabella sitting on the stage steps, looking up at the stars. He joined her, noticing how the garden lights made the roses look like they were glowing from within. "Your grandmother Sarah once told me that every garden needs 3 things to thrive," he said softly. "Sunshine for growth, rain for strength, and love for blooming. I think families need the same things." Isabella leaned against him, tired but happy. "We had the love all along, didn't we? It was just waiting, like seeds under the snow, until the right time came to grow." From where they sat, they could see Antonia and Harrison supervising the last of the cleanup, working together with the easy familiarity of old friends. The mansion behind them glowed warmly, no longer a mausoleum of memories, but a living, breathing home. "You know," Thomas said, "your father once told me that music has the power to heal what words cannot touch. I didn't understand then, but I do now." He hugged his granddaughter close. "Thank you for bringing the music back, sweetheart. Not just to this house, but to all our hearts." In the weeks following the concert, the Richardson estate settled into a new rhythm of life. The success of the inaugural performance had led to requests for more concerts in the garden space, and Thomas found himself working with local music schools to establish a regular series of student recitals and community performances. One bright morning, as autumn began to paint the garden in gold and crimson, Thomas sat in his study reviewing a particularly important piece of mail, the final verdict in Robert's case. His brother had been sentenced to several years in prison for his role in the accident and subsequent cover-up. But what caught Thomas's attention was the letter Robert had included with the legal documents. "I've had a lot of time to think," Robert had written. "Watching the news coverage of Isabella's concert, seeing how she's brought music back to the family, I finally understand what I tried to destroy. It was never about the money or the estate. It was about the life and love I could never accept in myself. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope someday Isabella will know that her music reached even me." Lost in thought, Thomas almost didn't notice Isabella entering the study. She had just returned from her morning piano lesson, her face glowing with enthusiasm. "Vovo, Professor Martinez says I'm ready to start working on Papa's original compositions." She paused, noticing the papers on his desk. "Is everything okay?" Thomas carefully folded Robert's letter. "Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes healing comes in unexpected ways." He smiled at her curious expression. "How would you feel about using some of your father's music in the next garden concert?" Isabella's eyes lit up. "Really? Could we include some of Mama's songs too? And maybe—" She hesitated, then continued with growing excitement. "Maybe we could invite children from the local shelter to attend. Some of them might never have heard classical music before." Thomas felt his heart swell with pride. This was his granddaughter's greatest gift, not just her musical talent, but her ability to see opportunities to share love and beauty with others. "That's a wonderful idea," he said. "Your grandmother Sarah always believed that beauty should be shared as widely as possible. That's why she made sure the garden could be seen from the street, even though some people thought such lovely roses should be kept private." Antonia appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray with fresh lemonade and cookies. Her health had improved, so much that she now insisted on helping Harrison with many of the household duties, though Thomas had made it clear she didn't need to. "I heard from my family in Brazil," she announced, setting down the tray. "They're coming for Christmas. They want to see where Maria's daughter has finally found her home." Isabella rushed to hug her grandmother, nearly knocking over the lemonade in her excitement. "Will they bring the videos? The ones of Mama singing in the music festival?" "Yes, and photos too. Your cousin Miguel has been digitizing all the old family albums." Antonia smoothed Isabella's hair fondly. "They say the whole community there still remembers Maria's voice. They call her the nightingale who flew north for love." Thomas watched them together, marveling at how naturally their two worlds had blended. The mansion that had once echoed with emptiness now rang with conversations in English and Portuguese, with music both classical and contemporary, with laughter and love in all its forms. Harrison entered with the day's mail, including a thick envelope from the city's Cultural Preservation Society. "Sir, they've approved our application. The Richardson Estate Gardens are now officially designated as a cultural heritage site." The designation meant that the gardens and performance space would be protected for future generations, ensuring that the legacy of music and love that had taken root there would continue to grow. "We should celebrate," Isabella declared, "with a special dinner in the garden and music, and maybe we could invite Professor Martinez and some of the other students." Thomas laughed at her enthusiasm. "I think that's a perfect idea. And while we're planning celebrations..." He pulled out another envelope from his desk drawer. "These arrived this morning. Tickets for us to visit Brazil after Christmas. I think it's time I saw where your mother's story began." Isabella's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Really? We're going to see where Mama grew up?" "Yes, and more than..." "Charlotte, I've been in touch with some of your mother's old music teachers. They've offered to let you study there for a few weeks, to learn the traditional music she loved so much." The excitement in the room was palpable. Antonia was already making lists of places they needed to visit, while Harrison offered suggestions about the best time to schedule the trip around the garden's maintenance needs. As they talked and planned, the sound of piano music drifted up. From below, one of the neighborhood children who had started taking lessons in the music room after school. The melody, though simple, carried the same spirit of joy and possibility that now filled every corner of the house. The Richardson estate had never looked more beautiful than it did that evening, as the family gathered in the garden for their celebration dinner. Lights twinkled in the trees, and the autumn roses released their sweet perfume into the cool evening air. The Cultural Heritage Designation plaque had been installed near the garden entrance, its brass surface catching the last rays of sunset. Professor Martinez and several of his students had joined them, along with families from the neighborhood who had become regular attendees of the garden concerts. The music room's new role as a community teaching space had transformed the mansion from a private sanctuary into a vibrant center of cultural life. As people mingled and chatted, Thomas stood back, watching Isabella move confidently among the guests. She had organized a small performance for the evening, featuring students who had never played before an audience. Her natural ability to encourage and support others reminded him so much of Maria's generous spirit. "She's a perfect blend of all of them, isn't she?" Antonia said softly, joining him. "James's talent, Maria's heart, and Sarah's grace. But she's also entirely her own person." Thomas nodded, thinking of how far they had come from that first startling encounter in his foyer. "She taught me that love isn't a finite resource that gets used up," he replied. "It's more like music. The more you share it, the more it grows." The evening's performance began with Isabella introducing each young musician, making sure they felt comfortable and supported. When it was her turn to play, she surprised everyone by inviting one of the shelter children to join her at the piano for a simple duet they had been practicing. The girl, shy at first, gained confidence with each note. Isabella guided her gently, just as Thomas had done during their first piano lesson together. The simple melody filled the garden, carrying with it all the hope and possibility that music could offer. After the performances, as people gathered around tables set up on the lawn, Harrison approached with a special delivery that had just arrived, a package from Brazil. Inside were restored videos of Maria performing at various concerts, including one particularly precious recording of her and James playing together at a small festival. They set up a projector in the garden, and soon the air was filled with Maria's voice, strong and clear across the years. The video showed her and James performing the first version of what would later become Symphony of Secrets. Even in that early recording, their love for each other was evident in every note they played. Isabella watched the video with shining eyes, one hand clasping her mother's pendant. When the recording ended, she turned to Thomas with determination in her face. "Vovo, I know what I want to do with my life. I want to teach music to children who might not otherwise have the chance to learn, like Mama did in Brazil and like Papa wanted to do here." Thomas hugged her close, his heart full of pride and love. "I think that's a perfect dream, sweetheart, and I know exactly how we can start." He gestured toward the mansion. "The East Wing has plenty of space for proper teaching studios. We could establish a music school for underprivileged children, carrying on both your parents' legacies." The idea took hold immediately. Professor Martinez offered to help develop a curriculum, while several of the parents present began discussing fundraising possibilities. The energy and enthusiasm in the garden was contagious, as if everyone could sense they were witnessing the birth of something special. As the evening drew to a close, Isabella sat at the garden piano one last time. The piece she played was new, something she had been composing secretly over the past few weeks. It incorporated elements of all her influences: classical structure from her father's training, Brazilian rhythms from her mother's heritage, and the simple, pure joy of making music that she had discovered in her new life at the mansion. The melody floated through the garden, weaving among the roses that Sarah had loved so much. dancing in the light of the stars that had witnessed so many changes in their family's story. It was a song of healing, of hope, of family bonds that couldn't be broken by time or distance or even misunderstanding. Thomas watched his granddaughter play, remembering the frightened little girl who had once cleaned his floors in secret. Now she sat confidently at the piano, her music touching hearts and changing lives, just as her parents had dreamed of doing. The rose-gold pendant at her neck caught the garden lights, seeming to pulse with its own inner music. In that moment, Thomas could almost feel Sarah's presence beside him, could almost hear James and Maria joining in their daughter's melody. The garden had become more than just a performance space. It was a living testament to the power of love to heal, to transform, and to create beautiful new beginnings from even the most painful endings. As the final notes faded into the night air, Isabella looked up at the stars and whispered, "This is just the beginning, isn't it?" Thomas smiled, knowing she was right. Their story, like the music they shared, would continue to grow and evolve, touching more lives and creating more harmony in the world. The Richardson legacy had been reborn, not in the way he had once imagined, but in a way that was far more beautiful and meaningful than he could have ever dreamed. The Brazilian summer sun cast warm shadows through the windows of Maria's childhood. Home as Thomas, Isabella, and Antonia sat in the cozy living room, surrounded by old photographs and mementos. They had arrived in São Paulo 2 days ago, and every moment since had been filled with discoveries that brought them closer to Maria's story. This was her favorite spot, Maria's mother, Dona Clara, said in Portuguese, which Isabella translated for Thomas. The elderly woman pointed to a worn cushion by the window, where a small upright piano still stood. She would sit here for hours, mixing classical pieces with our local rhythms until they became something entirely new. Thomas watched. As Isabella approached the piano reverently, her fingers hovering over the keys that her mother had once played. The room was exactly as Maria had left it, preserved with loving care by her family. Sheet music still sat in the rack, some pages marked with Maria's distinctive purple ink annotations. "May I?" Isabella asked, and at her grandmother's nod, she began to play. The melody she chose was Symphony of Secrets, but with a subtle difference. She incorporated the local rhythms she had been learning during their stay, blending her parents' composition with the pulse of her Brazilian heritage. Dona Clara wiped tears from her eyes as she listened. "Just like Maria," she whispered. She always knew how to make music speak in many languages at once. The past few days had been a revelation for all of them. Thomas had walked the streets where Maria had grown up, visited the music school where she had taught underprivileged children, and met the people who had shaped her early life. Each story, each memory shared, helped him understand more deeply the remarkable woman his son had fallen in love with. "Look at this," Dona Clara said, pulling out an old newspaper clipping. It showed a young Maria and James performing at a local music festival. The article praised their innovative fusion of classical and Brazilian music, noting how their performance had bridged cultural gaps and brought different communities together. "They were trying to tell us something even then," Thomas mused, studying the photograph, "about how love can transcend boundaries, how music can unite what prejudice tries to separate." Isabella, who had been exploring a box of her mother's old belongings, suddenly called out in excitement. "Vovô, look!" She held up a notebook filled with teaching plans and musical exercises. Mama was developing a special method for teaching music to children who couldn't afford formal lessons. She used games and stories to make it fun and accessible. Thomas took the notebook carefully, noting how detailed and thoughtful Maria's approach had been. This was exactly the kind of program they had been discussing for the Richardson estate's new music school. It was as if Maria had left them a blueprint for carrying her dream forward. Later that afternoon, they visited the community center where Maria had taught. Many of her former students, now adults with children of their own, gathered to meet Isabella and share their memories. One woman brought her daughter, who was exactly Isabella's age and studying piano using Maria's teaching methods. The two girls connected immediately through music, playing together on the center's old piano, while the adults watched with misty eyes. Despite speaking different languages, they communicated perfectly through rhythm and melody, just as James, And Maria had done. "Your mother believed that music was the purest form of communication," one of Maria's old colleagues told Isabella. "She used to say that when words fail, the heart can still sing." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the community center's windows, someone suggested an impromptu concert. Soon the room was filled with a joyous blend of classical and Brazilian music, with Isabella at the center, absorbing and incorporating every new rhythm she heard. Thomas sat back, watching his granddaughter bloom in this new environment. She had inherited not just her parents' musical talents, but their ability to bring people together through music. The Richardson legacy was evolving in ways he could never have imagined, becoming richer and more meaningful with each passing day. "Maria would be so proud," Antonia said softly, watching Isabella learn a traditional Brazilian rhythm from one of the local musicians. This is exactly what she and James dreamed of, their music bringing people together, breaking down walls, creating something new and beautiful. As the evening progressed, more people arrived, bringing instruments and stories to share. The simple gathering transformed into a celebration of Maria's legacy, with music flowing freely between classical pieces and local rhythms, just as she had always loved. Their last evening in Brazil was spent in Dona Clara's garden, where the highest tropical flowers bloomed in riotous color under the stars. The family had gathered for a final dinner, but it felt more like a beginning than an ending. Plans had been made, connections strengthened, and new possibilities had bloomed like the flowers surrounding them. "I have something for you, Dona Sá," Clara said to Thomas, disappearing into the house and returning with a small weathered box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, that Maria had written but never sent, chronicling her life with James and their hopes for their daughter. "She wanted you to have these someday," Dona Clara explained through Isabella's translation. "She believed that understanding would come with time and that love would eventually find its way home." Thomas held the letters carefully, recognizing Maria's purple ink and flowing handwriting. Here was another piece of the puzzle, another thread connecting their families across time and distance. Isabella sat at a small table nearby, working intently on something in her notebook. She had been taking detailed notes throughout their visit, recording not just music, but stories, traditions, and teaching methods that she wanted to incorporate into their plans for the Richardson Estate's music school. "Look, Vovo," she said, showing him her sketches. "We could adapt the community center's program for our students back home, and maybe we could do exchange programs, connecting students from both countries through music, just like Mama and Papa did." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and soon everyone was contributing ideas. Dona Clara offered to help develop a curriculum that would honor both classical and Brazilian musical traditions. Maria's former colleagues proposed online masterclasses to share their teaching methods. Even the local music school's director suggested a partnership that would allow students to study in both countries. As they talked and planned, Thomas noticed Isabella slip away to the garden's small gazebo, where an old piano had been placed for outdoor gatherings. She began to play softly, not her parents' symphony or her own compositions, but something new that seemed to capture everything they had experienced during their visit. The melody carried echoes of classical structure, but was infused with Brazilian rhythms and harmonies. It spoke of family bonds that transcended borders, of love that survived loss, of music that could heal old wounds and create new connections. One by one, the family gathered around the piano, drawn by the music. Dona Clara began to sing softly, adding traditional lyrics that seemed to fit perfectly with Isabella's melody. Other relatives joined in with percussion instruments, and soon the garden was filled with a joyous fusion of musical styles and cultural traditions. Thomas watched his granddaughter at the center of it all, her fingers dancing over the keys, while the rose-gold pendant at her neck caught the starlight. She had found her place in both worlds, just as her parents had hoped she would. Later, as the party wound down and family members began to say their goodbyes, Dona Clara took Thomas aside. Maria always said that James had his father's heart, strong, capable of great love, but sometimes hidden behind walls of expectation and tradition. She knew that one day those walls would come down and the music would flow freely again. Thomas nodded, understanding at last the full depth of Maria's wisdom and patience. "She was right about so many things," he said softly, "especially about how love can transform us if we let it." As they prepared to leave the next morning, the family gathered one last time in the garden. Isabella sat at the piano again, but this time she invited everyone to join her in a special arrangement she had created, a piece that wove together themes from Symphony of Secrets with traditional Brazilian melodies. The music rose into the morning air, a testament to the power of love to bridge distances, heal wounds, and create beautiful new harmonies from separate melodies. It was more than just a goodbye. It was a promise of things to come, of connections that would continue to grow and strengthen. Thomas looked at his granddaughter, seeing in her the perfect blend of all the love stories that had led to this moment. James and Maria's passion for music, Sarah's belief in the healing power of beauty, and the unshakable faith of two families from different worlds that love would eventually find its way home. The rose gold pendant gleamed in the morning sun, its petals seeming to dance with the music. Like the garden at the Richardson estate, like the love that had brought them all together, it was a symbol of beauty that endured, of hope that bloomed, even in the most unlikely places, of music that could transform grief into joy and separation into unity. The Richardson estate welcomed them back with an unexpected surprise. During their absence, Harrison had overseen the completion of several projects they had discussed before leaving. The east wing of the mansion had been transformed into a series of bright, welcoming music studios, ready for the new school they had planned to establish. "Harrison, this is incredible," Thomas said, walking through the renovated spaces. Each room had been carefully designed to accommodate different types of lessons and group activities, incorporating ideas from Maria's teaching notes and the Brazilian Community Center. Isabella ran from room to room, her eyes shining with excitement. She stopped at the largest studio, where a wall of windows overlooked Sarah's rose garden. "Look, Vovo. The students can see the roses while they practice, just like Papa did when he was learning." The room's centerpiece was a beautiful grand piano, positioned so that the morning light would fall across the keys. On the walls, Harrison had arranged photographs in chronological order: Sarah at her beloved roses, James performing at various concerts, Maria teaching at the Brazilian Community Center, and finally, Isabella playing at the garden concert. "I hope you don't mind," Harrison said, gesturing to the photos. "I thought it was important for the students to understand the legacy they're becoming part of." Thomas squeezed his faithful caretaker's shoulder, too moved for words. Harrison had understood perfectly what they were trying to create. Not just a music school, but a place where different cultures and traditions could blend and grow together, just like the roses in the garden. Antonia explored the spaces with particular interest in the room designated for vocal instruction. "Maria would have loved this," she said softly, running her hand along the acoustic panels. "She always said that singing was the purest form of music because it came directly from the heart." The transformation wasn't limited to the East Wing. The entire mansion seemed lighter, more alive. The heavy drapes that had once blocked the sunlight had been replaced with sheer curtains that allowed natural light to flood every room. The walls, once dominated by formal portraits, now displayed a mix of family photographs and artwork from both their American and Brazilian heritage. In the music room, they found another surprise. Harrison had carefully arranged all of Maria's teaching materials, brought back from Brazil, alongside James's old music books and Sarah's garden journals. The blend of languages, traditions, and teaching methods seemed to perfectly represent the new chapter in their family's story. "There's one more thing," Harrison said, leading them to the garden. The performance space had been enhanced with new lighting and sound systems, making it suitable for year-round use. But the most touching addition was a small plaque near the stage engraved with words from Maria's newly discovered letters. "Music is the language of the heart, speaking across all borders and healing all wounds." Isabella read the words aloud, her voice carrying across the garden where the autumn roses still bloomed. Then, without saying anything, she walked to the piano and began to play. The melody was new, something she had composed during their flight home, weaving together all the musical traditions she had experienced in Brazil with the classical foundation she had learned at the mansion. As she played, Thomas noticed something remarkable. The roses nearest the stage seemed to sway gently, though there was no breeze. It reminded him of how Sarah used to say that flowers could dance to music if the melody came from the heart. "I think," Isabella said during a pause in her playing, "this is what Mama and Papa were trying to create all along. Not just music, but a place where different kinds of beauty could grow together." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "The contractors said something interesting while you were away. They said they'd never worked on a house that seemed so alive, so eager to be transformed. It was as if the mansion itself wanted to become something new." Thomas understood exactly what they meant. The house that had once been a shrine to his grief had become a living testament to love's ability to heal and transform. Every room now held not just memories of the past, but promises for the future. "When do we start the classes?" Isabella asked eagerly, her fingers still moving over the keys. "I've been practicing the teaching games Mama used in Brazil, and I think—" She stopped suddenly, noticing something unusual. A small rosebud had appeared on one of the vines near the stage, a pure white bloom with just a hint of pink at its edges, exactly like the ones Sarah had loved most. It was unusual for roses to bloom so late in the season, but then again, nothing about their family's story had followed the expected path. 1 year had passed since the day Thomas found a small girl cleaning his floors. The Richardson estate, once a symbol of loss and isolation, had blossomed into a vibrant center of music and learning. The music school, officially named the James and Maria Richardson Institute for Musical Arts, had opened its doors to students from all backgrounds, carrying forward the dream that had begun decades ago. On this particular evening, the garden performance space was filled once again, but this time for a very special recital. Students from both the local community and the Brazilian exchange program were preparing to perform, each bringing their own unique interpretation to the music. They had learned. Thomas stood at the back of the garden, watching Isabella move among the nervous young performers, offering encouragement just as her mother had once done. She had grown so much in the past year, not just in height, but in confidence and purpose. The rose gold pendant still hung at her neck, but it was no longer a symbol of loss. Instead, it had become a reminder of how love could bridge any distance. "She's a natural teacher," Antonia said, joining him. Her health had fully restored, and she now served as the school's cultural director, ensuring that both classical and Brazilian traditions were honored in their curriculum. Just like Maria, the evening's program was a beautiful blend of styles and traditions. Students performed everything from Bach to Brazilian folk songs, often finding innovative ways to combine different musical elements. The garden itself seemed to participate in the performances, with Sarah's roses releasing their perfume into the evening air and the newly installed lighting creating an ethereal atmosphere. When it was Isabella's turn to perform, she surprised everyone by inviting all her students to join her on stage. Together, they performed a new arrangement of Symphony of Secrets that incorporated elements from every musical tradition represented. At the school, the result was something entirely new yet deeply familiar, a perfect expression of how love and music could transform and grow while staying true to their roots. As Thomas watched his granddaughter lead the performance, he felt the presence of all those who had helped create this moment. Sarah with her belief in the healing power of beauty, James and Maria with their courage to follow their hearts, and even Robert, whose actions had ultimately led to healing and redemption. The final piece of the evening was a surprise. Isabella stepped forward, holding Maria's old teaching notebook. "Tonight we're going to perform something special," she announced. "While we were in Brazil, we found a lullaby that my mother wrote when she was expecting me. We've arranged it for all our students to perform together." The melody that filled the garden was simple, yet profound. Children from different backgrounds, speaking different languages, came together to create something beautiful. As they played, Thomas noticed that same white rosebud from their return had fully bloomed, its petals glowing in the evening light. After the performance, as families and students mingled in the garden, Thomas found himself back in his study. The room had changed along with the rest of the house, now filled with photographs, children's artwork, and sheet music from both classical and Brazilian composers. On his desk sat the last letter from Robert, received just that morning. The "Music reaches even here," his brother had written from prison. "Some of the other inmates have started a choir, inspired by news of your school. Perhaps healing can happen anywhere if we let it." A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Isabella stood there, still holding her mother's notebook. "Vovo, I've been thinking, what if we expanded the school's program? We could offer scholarships to students from all over the world, create a place where different musical traditions could meet and grow together." Thomas smiled, recognizing in her enthusiasm the same passion that had driven James and Maria. "I think that's a wonderful idea, sweetheart. After all, that's what this place has become, a garden where all kinds of beauty can grow." Later, that night, as the last guests departed and the garden lights dimmed, Thomas and Isabella sat together at the piano in the music room. The melody they played was neither classical nor Brazilian, but something uniquely their own, a song of family, of healing, of love that transcended all boundaries. Above them, stars twinkled through the skylight Sarah had always wanted installed. The roses in the garden swayed gently in the evening breeze, their perfume drifting through the open windows. And in the gentle notes of the piano, one could almost hear the echoes of all the love stories that had led to this moment, each one a different melody in the eternal symphony of the heart. 5 years had passed since music first returned to the Richardson estate. The James and Maria Richardson Institute for Musical Arts had grown beyond anyone's expectations, becoming a beacon of cultural exchange and artistic innovation. Students from around the world now filled the halls that had once echoed with emptiness, each bringing their own unique voice to the symphony of life that played out daily within its walls. On this particular morning, Thomas stood in the garden, watching as Isabella, now 13, conducted a masterclass for younger students. She had grown into a remarkable young woman, combining her father's musical genius with her mother's generous spirit. The rose-gold pendant still graced her neck, catching the morning light as she moved among her students with confident grace. "Remember what my mother always said," she told a nervous young pianist. "Music isn't about perfection. It's about speaking from your heart to another's." Her Portuguese accent, softened by years in America but still present, added a musical quality to her words that seemed entirely appropriate. The Institute had become exactly what James and Maria had dreamed of creating, a place where music transcended cultural boundaries and brought people together. The curriculum they had developed, combining Maria's innovative teaching methods with classical training, had attracted attention from music educators worldwide. "Mr. Richardson," Harrison called softly, approaching with a letter in hand. "The National Arts Council has approved our expansion proposal. We can begin construction on the new International Student Dormitory next month." The plans for the dormitory had been Isabella's idea, inspired by stories of her mother's early days in America. The building would provide housing for international students, ensuring that talented young musicians would have the opportunity to study at the Institute, regardless of their financial circumstances. As Thomas reviewed the approval documents, he could hear the sound of multiple musical traditions blending together from various practice rooms, classical piano mixing with Brazilian rhythms, traditional folk songs harmonizing with contemporary compositions. The mansion had become a living instrument, each room contributing its own note to the ongoing composition of their family's story. Antonia emerged from her office, where she had been conducting a video conference with music educators in Brazil. The cultural exchange program she had established was flourishing, creating bridges between communities, just as James and Maria had once dreamed of doing. "You should see the applications we're receiving for next semester," she said excitedly. "Children from all over the world, each with their own musical story to tell." Maria would have loved seeing this. Thomas nodded, remembering the shy young woman who had captured his son's heart with her belief in music's power to unite people. She and James saw this potential long before any of us. They knew that music could build bridges we couldn't even imagine. In the garden, Isabella had moved her class outside, gathering her students around Sarah's roses. She often incorporated her grandmother's gardening wisdom into her teaching, helping her students understand how music, like flowers, needed both structure and freedom to truly bloom. Music and gardens speak the same language, she told them, gesturing to a particularly beautiful white rose with pink-tipped petals. They both need care, patience, and love to reach their full potential, and when they bloom, she paused, touching her pendant thoughtfully, they create beauty that belongs to everyone. The morning's lessons concluded with a spontaneous performance in the garden. Students from different countries and backgrounds came together, creating an impromptu arrangement that blended their various musical traditions. The roses seemed to sway in appreciation, their perfume mingling with the music in the warm air. Later, in the quiet of his study, Thomas found himself looking through old photographs. There was James at his first piano recital, Sarah tending, her beloved roses, Maria teaching at the Brazilian Community Center, and now new photos of Isabella continuing their legacy in ways they could never have imagined. A knock at the door interrupted his reverie. Isabella entered, carrying a familiar notebook, Maria's old teaching journal, its pages now supplemented with her own notes and observations. "Vovô," she said, her eyes shining with excitement. "I've been thinking about Papa and Mama's symphony. What if we arranged it for a full orchestra? We could include traditional instruments from all our students' cultures, make it even more inclusive than they originally imagined." The idea of reimagining James and Maria's symphony took root and blossomed, much like Sarah's beloved roses. Over the next few months, the Institute became a hub of collaborative creativity, as students and teachers worked together to arrange the piece for a multicultural orchestra. Isabella led the project with a vision that seemed to channel both her parents. She worked tirelessly to ensure that each cultural tradition represented at the Institute found its voice in the arrangement while maintaining the original composition's emotional core. "Listen to how the Brazilian berimbau complements the classical strings here," she explained to Thomas one evening, playing a recording of their progress. "It's like Mama and Papa's voices talking to each other across time." The project had another unexpected effect. It began to heal old wounds in the community. Former students of both James and Maria came forward with their own memories and contributions. Even Robert, still serving his sentence, sent a letter expressing how news of the project had touched him. "Perhaps this is what redemption sounds like," he wrote, "a melody that brings people together instead of driving them apart." On the evening of the performance, the garden was transformed. The stage had been expanded to accommodate the full orchestra, an extraordinary blend of classical and traditional instruments from around the world. Students wore their national dress alongside formal concert attire, creating a visual harmony that matched the musical fusion they were about to perform. Thomas stood at the back of the garden, watching as people filled every available space. He recognized faces from both their American and Brazilian families, music educators from around the world, and community members who had supported the Institute from its beginning. Antonia approached, elegant in a traditional Brazilian dress. "Maria once told me," she said softly, "that true love is like a seed. It might take years to bloom, but when it does, it creates beauty beyond anything we could have imagined." The performance began with Isabella at the piano, playing the original opening notes of Symphony of Secrets. Gradually, other instruments joined in, classical strings and woodwinds blending with percussion from Brazil, wind instruments from Asia, and drums from Africa. The melody that James and Maria had written as a duet became a global conversation, each cultural voice adding its own perspective while maintaining the piece's essential message of love, transcending boundaries. As the music swelled, Thomas noticed something extraordinary. The roses in the garden seemed to glow softly in the evening light, their petals moving in perfect harmony with the music. The white rose with pink-tipped petals that had bloomed so unexpectedly years ago had multiplied, creating a living border around the performance space. In the middle of the orchestra, Isabella conducted with graceful confidence the rose gold, pendant at her neck, catching the light with each movement. She had arranged the final movement to include a children's choir, their young voices singing lyrics in multiple languages that celebrated the universal language of music and love. The Me performance concluded with a powerful fusion of all the musical elements, building to a crescendo that seemed to make the very air vibrate with emotion. As the final notes faded into the evening sky, there was a moment of profound silence before the garden erupted in applause. Thomas found himself wiping away tears as he watched his granddaughter acknowledge the audience's response. She had taken her parents' dream and expanded it beyond anything they could have imagined, creating something that honored the past while building a bridge to the future. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the garden had quieted, Thomas and Isabella sat together on the stage steps. Above them, stars twinkled in the clear night sky, seeming to dance in rhythm with the leftover echoes of the evening's music. "Do you think they heard it?" Isabella asked softly, leaning against her grandfather's shoulder. "Mama, Papa, and Grandmother Sarah." Thomas smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I think they've been hearing every note since the day you first walked into this house. They knew, even before we did, that love would find its way home through music." Isabella touched her pendant thoughtfully. "It's never really an ending, is it? It's always just another beginning." "That's right," Thomas agreed, looking out over the moonlit garden where Sarah's roses continued their quiet dance. "Every ending carries the seeds of a new beginning, just like every piece of music contains the possibility of a new arrangement." The roses swayed gently in the night breeze, their perfume carrying the promise of tomorrow's blooms. In the distance, the lights of the Institute glowed warmly, ready to welcome another day of music, learning, and love. The Richardson estate, once a sanctuary of solitude, had become exactly what James and Maria had dreamed of, a place where love spoke through music, where different cultures and traditions blended into something beautiful and new, where every heart could find its own unique way to sing. 10 years had passed since a small girl with trembling hands first brought music back to the Richardson estate. The James and Maria Richardson Institute had become a landmark in the international music community, its innovative approach to musical education inspiring similar programs around the world. On this particular autumn morning, Thomas stood in his study, watching through the window as Isabella, now 18, guided a group of young students through their morning practice in the garden. She had grown into a remarkable young woman, her talent as a musician matched only by her gift for teaching and bringing people together. "Your parents would be so proud," he whispered, touching a framed photograph on his desk. The picture showed James and Maria at their last performance together, their faces radiant with love and passion for their music. A knock at the door drew his attention. Harrison entered, carrying an envelope bearing the seal of one of Europe's most prestigious music conservatories. "It arrived this morning, sir," he said, his voice betraying his excitement. Thomas took the envelope, knowing what it contained but waiting for Isabella to share the moment. He called her in from the garden, and she arrived with her cheeks flushed from the morning air, the rose gold pendant still gracing her neck after all these years. "Is that?" she asked, her eyes widening at the sight of the envelope. "Open it," Thomas encouraged, handing it to her. With trembling fingers, Isabella broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Her eyes scanned the contents quickly, filling with tears of joy. "They accepted me, full scholarship for their international music education program." The news was extraordinary, but not unexpected. Isabella's innovative teaching methods, combining classical training with multicultural approaches, had already attracted attention from music educators worldwide. The conservatory's program would allow her to further develop these methods while studying with some of the world's finest musicians. "But what about the institute?" she asked, suddenly concerned. "I can't leave our students." Thomas smiled, remembering how Maria had expressed similar concerns about leaving her students in Brazil. "The institute will be here when you return," he assured her. "Besides, I think it's time we implemented that distance learning program you've been designing. You could teach masterclasses from Europe, connecting our students with musicians from around the world." Antonia appeared in the doorway, having overheard the conversation. "Your mother always said that love grows stronger when it learns to bridge distances," she reminded Isabella gently. "This is your chance to build new bridges, just like she did." Later that afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows through the garden, Isabella gathered her students to share the news. Instead of expressions of sadness at her upcoming departure, The children surprised her with their enthusiasm and questions about how they could connect with other young musicians across the ocean. "We could have virtual concerts," one excited student suggested, "with students from all over the world playing together. And share different musical traditions," another added. "Learn from each other's cultures." Thomas watched from the terrace as his granddaughter's face lit up with possibilities. She had inherited not just her parents' musical talents, but their ability to see opportunities where others might see obstacles. That evening, as the garden filled with the sound of practice, sessions winding down, Thomas found Isabella seated at the piano in the music room. She was playing a piece he hadn't heard before, something that seemed to weave together classical elements with rhythms from various world music traditions. "It's a thank you," she explained when he asked about the composition. "For everything. This house has given me for all the love that brought me here." She paused, her fingers hovering over the keys. "I used to think this pendant was just a beautiful piece of jewelry that connected me to my past. But now I understand it's more than that. It's a reminder that love always finds its way home, even when the path takes unexpected turns." Thomas sat beside her on the piano bench, just as he had done that first night so many years ago. "Your mother once wrote something similar in one of her letters," he recalled. "She said that true love is like music. It can cross any border, speak any language, and find its way into any heart that's willing to listen." Outside, the garden had taken on the golden hues of autumn, Sarah's roses still blooming despite the changing season. The white roses with pink-tipped petals that had appeared so mysteriously years ago had spread throughout the garden, creating a living testament to love's ability to grow and multiply in unexpected ways. On Isabella's last evening before departing for Europe, the Richardson estate hosted a special concert in the garden. Students, teachers, and community members gathered to celebrate not just her achievement, but the extraordinary journey that had transformed a house of silence into a global center of musical harmony. The garden was in full bloom, Sarah's roses, creating a fragrant backdrop to the performance space. As twilight approached, soft lights illuminated the pathways, creating an ethereal atmosphere that seemed to bridge the gap between past and present, between earth and heaven. Before the music began, Thomas stood to address the gathering. Looking out over the faces illuminated by the garden lights, he saw the living legacy of James and Maria's dream, people from different cultures and backgrounds, united by their love of music and their belief in its power to transform lives. 11 years ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, this house was silent. The music had stopped, the roses had withered, and love seemed like a distant memory. He paused, looking at Isabella, who sat at the piano, the rose-gold pendant gleaming at her throat. But then a little girl appeared, cleaning my floors and crying quietly. Unaware that she was about to change everything, she brought with her not just music, but a reminder that love never truly ends. It just waits for the right moment to bloom again. Isabella began to play softly, her fingers finding the opening notes of Symphony of Secrets. But this version was different. She had arranged it as a tribute to all the love stories that had shaped her life. The melody incorporated elements from every chapter of their family's journey. Sarah's passion for beauty, James and Maria's courage to follow their hearts, and the endless possibilities that arose when love was allowed to grow freely. As she played, Thomas noticed something extraordinary. The roses seemed to glow with an inner light, their petals moving in perfect harmony with the music. The white roses with pink-tipped edges that had first appeared on that transformative night years ago were particularly radiant, their beauty a testament to Sarah's enduring presence in the garden she had loved so much. Students from the Institute joined in gradually, adding their own instruments and voices to the symphony. The music swelled and soared, carrying with it all the hopes, dreams, and love that had brought them to this moment. Classical harmonies blended seamlessly with rhythms from around the world, creating something entirely new yet deeply rooted in tradition. Through it all, the rose-gold pendant at Isabella's neck caught and reflected the garden lights, seeming to pulse with its own inner music. It was no longer just a piece of jewelry or even a family heirloom. It had become a symbol of how love could transform and heal, how beauty could emerge from pain, and how music could bridge the gaps between hearts and cultures. As the final notes of the symphony faded into the evening air, a gentle breeze swept through the garden, carrying the perfume of roses. In that moment, it seemed as if all the love stories that had shaped their family were present. Sarah tending her beloved, roses, James and Maria creating their music of hope, and all the students and teachers who had found their own voices in this special place. Thomas wrapped his arm around his granddaughter's shoulders as she joined him on the garden path. "Remember," he said softly, "wherever your music takes you, this will always be your home. The roses will keep blooming. The students will keep learning, and love will keep finding new ways to sing." Isabella touched her pendant, tears glistening in her eyes. "Mama was right," she whispered. "Love is like music. It never really ends. It just keeps changing and growing, finding new hearts to touch and new stories to tell." As night fell and stars began to twinkle above the garden, the last notes of music faded into a peaceful silence. But it wasn't the heavy silence that had once filled the mansion. It was the quiet contentment of a house filled with love, of a garden rich with memories, of hearts united by the endless symphony of life. The Richardson estate, once a monument to loss, had become a testament to love's ability to heal, transform, and create beauty from pain. Through the universal language of music, it had become a place where different cultures and traditions could meet and blend, where new generations could learn not just about notes and rhythms, but about the power of love to bridge any distance and heal any wound. As Thomas looked at his granddaughter one last time before she left for her new adventure, he saw in her the perfect blend of all their family's love stories: Sarah's grace, James's passion, Maria's wisdom, and her own unique ability to bring people together through music. The legacy would continue, growing and changing like the roses in the garden, creating new harmonies for generations to come.